Catherine, welcome. It's great to have you with us today. Before we begin and get very technical, could you perhaps give me a quick rundown of your own journey into biotech?
Will do, Nick. I'm an avid listener of your podcast, so it's great to actually be able to speak with you today. My journey started, I did my PhD in biochemistry, like a lot of people who enter this industry. And then after that, I actually went to work for a life science reagents provider, Qkine, which to people who work in the life science industry is now a global brand with, I think, a 2.5 billion market cap. When I joined as employee 35. So years and years ago, when that company was doing a scaling journey, which you could argue could be parallelizing what cultivated meat companies are trying to do these days. That was a fantastic experience, scaling a lab straight out of PhD. Learned so much about the impact of quality and how important reproducibility is across the board in biotech. And after that, I actually took a little bit of a career break. I had tiny children, so I took a career break, did lots of marketing, business development, consultancy, all sorts of bits and bobs, worked with some really fun people. And then I went back into academia. A bit of a mad career choice, but absolutely wonderful. And I actually studied complex protein libraries, which parasites use to invade red blood cells. So trying to identify proteins involved with invasion of red blood cells. Absolutely mad. Absolutely wonderful. And it was while I was doing that I was introduced to Marco Hooverman, who's a structural biochemist in the University of Cambridge. And he had a really mission-led drive to improve the quality of growth factors that were available to stem cell biologists. He'd been involved with some of the pioneers of stem cell biology here in Cambridge. And we were chatting, and to cut a long story short, we founded Qkine at the end of 2016, and we've been scaling ever since. So we're a specialist in growth factor manufacturers. It's what we do. We're protein biochemists. We started initially working with the biomedical sector, really looking at how to tackle some of the problems that industry had with scaling stem cell-based manufacturing for use in drug discovery pipelines. So really looking at removing animal components, better ways of scale, better performance of the growth factors. And then there was this really exciting emerging industry. It's sort of early 2020 in the cultivated meat space. And a lot of the challenges and also a lot of the companies we were working with were also in the cellular agriculture field. So companies like Meatable, connected with BitBio here in Cambridge. So we sort of naturally segued to try and start helping some of those customers with their scaling challenge. And that's why today we're actually working with cultivated meat companies sort of across the world, trying to really help and support using our growth factor expertise.
Mm-hmm. And how do you view your company's role in the global cell ag sector? You're a UK company, but you're definitely global in scale.
Yes, we are. So we're still quite a small company, I'd say. So we're about 30 people based here in Cambridge. What we sell to we have customers in over 33 countries actually worldwide. So we operate on the world stage. The science that we do as an industry is the same irrespective of which country you're in. And our particular focus here is really on the more complex growth factors. So growth factors can be split really into two different categories, and we'll probably talk a little bit more in detail about this later. But we have special expertise in the TGF-beta family growth factors, which are incredibly complex proteins, very difficult to manufacture with a high degree of quality and bioactivity. And the other side of what we do here is we're very proactively trying to build out all the growth factors that this industry needs. So anyone in this industry will know that there is very, very few growth factors available that are species specific. So, for instance, even simple things like bovine and porcine EGF, which is one of the common growth factors, a lot of companies use them, it's only available in a human form. So what we're trying to do is to extend the availability of growth factors to really support that research base and the translation into media development in companies, and use our core skills in optimizing growth factors for better use in bioreactors and higher manufacturing yields to really try and catalyze the development of the supply chain.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to be focusing for the next 30 or so minutes on growth factors. As many of us will know, these are indispensable tools in cultivated meat production, enabling the replication of the biological processes that occur in living animals, allowing for the creation of meat without the need for traditional livestock farming. So let's get some basics out of the way, Catherine. Could you provide me with a layman's overview, the idiot's guide, I am the idiot in this case, of what growth factors are and how they are used in cultivated meat production?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you mentioned, Nick, these are naturally occurring proteins that in the human body, particularly during the development of early embryology, they're incredibly potent proteins that are secreted by cells to act on other cells to develop those tissues. And what's particularly relevant for this industry is because they are incredibly potent proteins, they're subject to a wide variety of regulation within the animal, and the sort of the those control mechanisms that operate within the human body are not necessarily the same control mechanisms that you want to act within a bioreactor. And these growth factors, they bind onto receptors on the cell surface, and they give those cells a very carefully orchestrated set of signals to tell them to either proliferate, so to grow, or increase biomass in this industry, or a set of signals that tells them to turn into a particular cell type. So, for instance, a muscle cell, or indeed to mature as a muscle cell. And then in the cultivated meat, or indeed in any sort of stem cell or primary cell culture conditions, what you do is you take these proteins, you mix them into the media, the liquid that the cell's growing, and you again use these proteins to give those cells instructions about what to do or to aid their survival.
How, for instance, growth factors differ from other components used in the cell culture, such as the media or the scaffolds?
Yeah, absolutely. So we all know that the recombinant protein, which growth factors are, element of the cell culture media, constitutes a lot of cost in the media. So those recombinant proteins split into what I call more the bulk proteins, so the albumins and transferrins, and then the growth factors, which are the bioactive components, so the messengers within that media. And then the scaffold is really interesting. So the scaffold is also able to interact with the proteins that are in the media and the cells themselves. So the scaffold really underpins all of those interactions, and it enables the cells to grow effectively in a bioreactor conditions. So it allows them to mimic being adhered onto a surface. While the growth factors are usually in the media, may associate with the scaffold and could be forced to associate with the scaffold, which is a really interesting area, to really give those cells messages about how to behave.
Mm-hmm. In what ways can these products that you're developing there at Qkine impact the scalability and cost effectiveness of cultivated meat production? We hear all the time that these are the major challenges for some of these companies succeeding.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been quite interesting. So over the last few months, there have also been some conversations about whether growth factors, which people do speak about a lot in terms of scalability challenges, whether actually when the industry matures and we have appropriate economies of scale, whether growth factors really are the challenge, the most challenging component in media. Personally, I don't think they are going to be. But what I do think we need is a level of innovation now to make sure that we are developing the correct components ready for scale. So for instance, we can adapt growth factors. We can keep their natural sequence, but we can adapt them to remove some of the sort of natural control mechanisms that act well in the human body but don't want to act well in a bioreactor to improve their functionality. So by combining innovation in growth factors with cell line development, so developing cells which are deliberately require less growth factor, and combining, intelligent manufacturing scale up. Now, I think the jury is still out whether a microbial fermentation system, which is what we use here at Qkine, we do everything in animal-free microbial fermentation, or one of the newer expression systems, or one of the original expression systems around plant expression, molecular farming. I'm fairly agnostic over what the final scaled up production scenario is. But at the moment, the industry needs to really focus on deciding what to scale as much as how to scale it. Our innovations, a lot of our innovations are actually expression system agnostic because they're to do with the core functionality of the proteins themselves.
There seems to be a trend towards specialization, and companies such as Extracellular, Maltus, companies like that, and obviously yourselves. Some companies, cultivated meat companies, they might have the expertise in house, or they might call upon a company like Qkine. What are the pros and cons of either, do you think?
So I think collaboration is going to be really important in this industry, and however that flavor is. Now, no pun intended. So sorry. So I think it's entirely feasible that when this industry matures, large providers will want to have control over key parts of their supply chain, so things like growth factor manufacture. And it may well be that they license in or collaborate with providers to make sure they build that in-house capacity. The other, obviously, option is to source in and build a really strong, credible supply chain. One of the challenges, particularly focused on growth factors there are very few manufacturers of growth factors worldwide. And any industrial process is going to need at least two suppliers at all times because of supply chain redundancy, which we all learned an awful lot about during COVID. So I think we will have a mixed model. I'm hoping we'll start to see more co-location of companies of different types. So the supply chain, even the energy providers, co-locating into campus style plants, for want of a better term, to really get that efficiency and also to drive sustainability, because we don't want to be shipping growth factors around the world in order to be able to build a local manufacturing plant.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to be coming onto the supply chain shortly. Are there any challenges or limitations associated with the use of these products that you're developing?
I think there are generally challenges for the industry. So all growth factors weren't created equal. So we have what I'd say the simple growth factors. So things like FGF2, IGF1, which are used in most media for cultivated meat production. And they are, from a manufacturing perspective, quite easy to manufacture. So we're already starting to see a number of companies who are specialised in making FGF2 at bulk. That's great. It's fantastic. The part of the industry where we're starting to see challenges is in the much more complex growth factors. So like the TGF-beta families. Now, most of these cultures will require one of the members of that protein family in their culture media. And these are, I won't protein geek too much, don't worry, but these are really interesting proteins because they're complex, they're dimeric, and they have to form a really specific structure in order to be biologically active. So and that's definitely non-trivial, and it requires either expression in a mammalian cell culture production system, which is not compatible with cultivated meat, nor could it scale to meet the costs needed in cultivated meat, or a microbial system like ours. I haven't yet seen any credible demonstrations of production plant, but I hope that comes. And actually, we're interested in collaborating if anyone wants to work in that sector, because we do think that this is a future challenge. One quite sad thing, actually, Nick, is we're also hearing from sort of customers and academic collaborators that for some of the growth factors, there are already starting to be quality challenges. So because these are bioactive proteins, you have to be very careful that they are biologically active. Because, for instance, if you look at TGF-beta family protein, so activin A, TGF-beta 1, TGF-beta 3, if they form their complex dimeric structure, beautifully active, one of the most bioactive proteins you can imagine, they also exist quite happily as monomers, so without the connection between the two, and they're entirely inactive, or they have very, very low activity. But if you're evaluating a supplier, it's actually hard to tell what you've got in your tube or what you've got in your tank. So those sorts of challenges are already starting to impact customers, and I can see that's one real challenge as we scale, is maintaining the biological, the sort of cohesive biology within a bioreactor, because stem cells themselves, or even sort of primary satellite cells, they're very delicate biological systems. They're not trivial to scale. And actually, having variability within those cell culture media ingredients has a huge impact on the cells themselves. So I think maintaining and scaling that biology is going to be a challenge for the industry. And actually, as a supply chain, I think we need to make sure that the supply chain themselves hold themselves accountable for allowing our customers and collaborators to be successful.
Mhm. Now, I'm going to hold my hands up. I have not tried a cultivated meat product yet. Have you?
No, I would love to. I'm hoping to. Well, there have been some very interesting regulatory approvals recently. So, but if not, I think it's definitely that trip to Singapore is definitely on the cards. It has to be,
Uh-huh.
doesn't it?
Well, we're trying to
Whereabouts?
arrange
Where
for.
would you go, Nick? Are you going to go?
I can't wait to taste it. Just
Mm,
out of curiosity. I mean, if I had the option to buy something that was more sustainable, that didn't impact animal welfare, then it's a no-brainer for me. And I think generationally, Alpha, for instance, they will be making those choices for us. It might not be the old fogies like me. But this is probably a silly question. Do the growth factors themselves contribute to the taste and texture of the final product? And are you able to tailor those factors for specific meat types or consumer preferences?
yes, it's a really, really good question, and it's a question that's making me think as well, Nick. So, theoretically, yes. So one of the examples I'd say is there are, so as you grow, say, a stem cell derived cultivated meat product, and some cultivated meat products are derived from stem cells, some are derived from primary cells, but as you grow those cells, you can change the growth factors in the media to, for instance, to mature the muscle. Now, within the traditional agriculture meat trade, maturation of muscle as animals age changes flavour. So in my simplistic model, yes, I don't think as an industry we're at that point yet. I think there are other things in the media as well which will massively impact the taste and the texture, things like lipids and some of the scaffolding materials we mentioned earlier. So I think it's intriguing. I think the industry is still battling with fundamentals at the moment, but I absolutely think that's a way that will mature over time.
Hmm. I mean, it is a very, very young industry. I mean, we've seen over the past year or so some criticism of the plant-based sector, and those targets are seemingly being pointed at cultivated meat. I mean, we're just in the early stages here. There's
Yeah.
no cause for alarm. No
No,
cause
I
for alarm.
agree. And also actually you were talking about the next generation. Part of the reason we're doing what we're doing at Qkine and helping cultivated meat and sort of becoming involved with these collaborations is because it is our children's generation that this will impact.
Hmm.
So, I just think it's really important that we all chip into the science of this as much as we can. In fact, one of my personal interest is actually in the cultivated seafood space because I think that from a health perspective and from a general sustainability perspective, I think that's going to be absolutely critical.
Hmm.
My interest is always in growth factors, and we have no clue what growth factors are going to be important for cultivating salmon or even some of the very simple crustacea require a different combination. So adding to the fundamental science will hopefully help push forwards that sector.
Hmm. Are there any ethical or sustainability concerns related to the use of growth factors? And if there are, how are you addressing these, or how would you address these?
So it's been interesting actually. Just recently, I've been trying to delve into some of the studies, the LCA studies, and you mentioned the UC Davis study and things like that. So to try and understand what the concerns are around sustainability, particularly within microbial expression. So microbial expression has been used for years to manufacture food processing aids and food enzymes, which are how growth factors are classed in the supply chain of cultivated meat very successfully. So for manufacturing additives for foods, for manufacturing and their enzymes to make cheese and things like that. So it's a very established, but none of us are sure at the scale at which it's going to be needed and whether things like bioreactors are going to be a problem. I think it's not really ethical, but I think as an industry, we just have to be really careful that we're always engaging with consumers and understanding consumer perception and pressure group and government perception as well. What we don't want this industry to do is to fall foul of some of the miscommunication or the lack of communication with consumers that ended up causing with the GMO issues. Obviously, we're of the generation where we remember Monsanto and all of that hoo-ha. And one of the things I'm finding really reassuring is when I'm going along to conferences and speaking with people, there's a very sensible engagement with consumers. But then we have, slightly worrying developments like the Italian or a minority of the Italian government starting to speak out against cultivated meat. I think, so I know it's not really an ethical issue around growth factors, but I think that those are sorts of areas we need to be careful of as an industry.
Mm-hmm. There's probably a lot of other factors that come into play, especially with Italy. Now, we know that cultivated meat faces some regulatory challenges, and we've seen recently in the past, where are we now? It's July, wasn't it, that we saw those green lights for Upside Foods and Good Meat. Do the supply chain providers, so companies such as Qkine, do you face the same hurdles?
We face very interesting hurdles, and it's so the companies that are preparing regulatory dossiers are often case, particularly if they're working with EFSA or the FCA here in the UK, often working maybe a little bit blind, and there's a little bit of a grey area around what's needed in terms of risk analysis of the supply chain. So what we're doing as a company is helping really define what's necessary within a growth factor. So that could be anything as making sure that there are no protein tags, which some regulators really, really don't like. What we've seen as a trend over the last year, really, as more people are moving towards first regulatory filings, is people are really looking at actually using much more well-defined growth factors where they can be confident that there's no animal components, no allergens, no non-wild type protein sequence. So really go and very high purity so that we can have very clear analytics, because it's the clarity of the supply chain is really important at the moment. So we have similar sort of slightly odd challenges because, as you said, the cultivated meat industry has just grown so rapidly that the regulatory environment and the expectations are maturing alongside. So there are some interesting questions for us internally about whether we need to introduce, ISO 22000, some food standards, and how you work as a high purity manufacturer with trying to provide information that's much more classically from a food background. It's not insurmountable. And then there's some interesting areas around analytics for the industry. I think that's going to be an important area, as the analytics haven't quite caught up with what we need to be doing at the moment.
Mm-hmm. But we're going to focus now, we're going to go back to supply chains. Now, a lot of the companies serving this industry, the cell ag industry, also serve other industries. Is there a danger that they might not be motivated to build a credible supply chain? And what can we do about that?
I mean, I think you've absolutely encapsulated one of the risks to this industry, Nick, actually. So there are very, sort of focusing just on growth factors to start with. So there are very few growth factor manufacturers globally. And most are also working with the biomedical sciences as well. And the stem cell based regenerative medicine market, the stem cell therapy market, and indeed using stem cells within drug discovery platforms, and organoids, they're all exploding at the moment. And they all also want to develop fully animal-free, fully defined, highly reproducible medias. Now, and as a supplier, you are always wondering whether you put your energies into supporting that industry or the cultivated meat industry, which has that thing that you're not supposed to do as a company, which is it's an industry that's heading towards commoditization. So as a supply chain and bulk, and it's quite interesting. I do actually also get pushback from people I'm working with. As well, why are you working in cellular agriculture? And part of the reason is that because it is young and it's driving innovation, and we can cross across both of those areas and use similar innovations in both those areas. But I think that is going to be a problem. And I really think that building close collaborations between all the elements of the supply chain and the cultivated meat companies is the most powerful way of addressing any of these challenges. But it is a good question. I mean, why would you work in the cellular agriculture supply chain?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of companies that are banking on it succeeding, and there's a lot of money that's been put into it. So we shall see. We shall see. Yeah. Certainly, we've seen a hell of a lot of breakthroughs in the past year in upside and good meat. I didn't think that would happen this time last year, so soon. So, and they're just the first. They're just the first. Are we seeing enough engagement with the supply chain? And do you see this as a problem?
I think we might just be starting to see that level of engagement as companies are moving towards more regulatory filings. But also we are starting to see the growth of the research base, the academic research base. What's super interesting about the dynamics of the cultivated meat and cultivated fish industry is it's an industry that's developed within biotech companies without really having a very broad, freely available peer-reviewed literature and research base. So with the recent investment in centres of excellence for cellular agriculture research within academic institutes, I think that's naturally driving more close collaboration with the supply chain providers as well, because we've got people who are looking for innovative reagents. And it's often easier for an academic group to collaborate with a company because there's less IP issues and things. Mm-hmm. I think collaboration, this industry is so huge, nobody can solve this in isolation. And the collaborations are going to be the strength of this industry going forwards. We've got such huge challenges to tackle together. Personally, I'd like to see more innovation from the supply chain being proactively communicated into the companies to really input into media optimization. So, for instance, there's been some fabulous single-cell sequencing publications from Joshua Flack and colleagues, so that's Mosameat and Bart Post's group. Really fantastic information, but mostly still based around human growth factors. So those sorts of really quite simple things we can start to address now as an industry with collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Now, you're a UK headquartered company. The UK finds itself in a pretty unique position, given it's probably the only decent thing to come out of Brexit, I would imagine.
I said that to someone the other day and nearly got shot down, but yes.
I probably know I'm a good company. I mean, can the UK be globally competitive in the cultivated meat sector?
Do you know, so there's a couple of interesting areas on that. So one of the things the UK has always been really, really good at is research. So, and we actually have had a lot of the pioneers of stem cell biology have been working in the UK lab. So we've actually got a very strong, sort of slightly tangential research base in the UK. We've also got a really good history in manufacturing. So I think we're possibly the 8th largest manufacturing organisation. So we've got some really good things going for the UK underpinning this sector. What we've lacked up to date has been government support and advocacy for the industry, and we're just starting to see some government investment into this area. So So I think that's a really good sign that this industry is moving forwards. We've got quite a good, talented sort of skills base in the UK for working in this sector, from the pharmaceutical companies, in terms of the automation and the scale up. We've always been very strong in food manufacturing. It's always been one of the UK's really big industries. So I think we can be globally competitive. Also, as you mentioned, Brexit, one of the wonderful things, or one of the things that may have been positive coming out of Brexit, is that the UK Food Standards Agency has a little bit more flexibility now. So it builds on that credible history of the European Food Standards Agency being accepted as the gold standard of novel food regulations. So that's a super powerful position. And I'm not a regulatory expert, but one of maybe the stumbling blocks of a European regulatory filing is that after acceptance by the EFSA, European Food Standards Authority, it then needs to be approved by member organisations and by a certain percentage of member organisations. Now, the UK is in quite a unique position in that it has that background from EFSA, but the ability to actually innovate now and have a level of independence. And I think that might be one of the reasons that we saw the recent submission by Aleph Farms, didn't we, in Switzerland and in the UK. So what I'd also say, just from personal experience as well, the people working in this industry in the UK are absolutely fantastic. I mean, collaborative, we've got great skills from pharma around media optimization, and we're starting to see a real mixing of this industry in the UK. I think there's hope that we can contribute on a global stage here.
Do you see much appetite from the UK government? I mean, we saw what happened last year with the executive order in the USA and what has happened since President Biden's executive order. Do you think the government's doing enough here?
I think it started to something. I think that's really good. So we've seen a couple of government non-dilutive grant funding from Innovate UK, so the UK's grant awarding body, go specifically focusing on this area. So that's really positive. And then just recently, it was announced that the £12 million EPSRC, so government-funded hub, has been announced for UK solar agriculture manufacturing. So that's led by Marion Ellis down in Bath. That's the largest single investment by the UK government into this sector. We're lucky enough to be one of the project partners on that grant, and I genuinely think that the group of people that's assembling, which covers, we're lucky being quite a small country because we can just pull together the entire country really in one place and have a conversation, have an open conversation. But I actually think in order to really have impact, it's going to need some serious investment. And, you know, slightly more critically, if you look at the sustainability impact of cultivated meat or cellular agriculture, should we say, so things like, you know, precision fermentation, production of palm oil and things like that. If you look at that and the impact that could have on future generations, the investment into that sector by the UK government is trivial compared to the investment in things like new battery technologies, which one could argue does have a big sustainability impact, but potentially less so long term. So I would like to see a bit of a balancing and a concerted effort from public funding to really push this building a sustainable food industry in the UK.
We're going to move to some wrap now questions, Catherine. We talked about that UC Davis report recently before we came on air. I mean, what do you think of the whole farmer grade versus food grade debate when it comes to growth factors?
Do you know, it's a really interesting question. So one thing that I'll just be really straight about it, for me, farmer grade and food grade does not mean high and low quality of product. That it's often used to, food grade's often used to describe or to imply a less crude, less refined product. Now, bluntly, with growth factors, that's not helpful. It's not helpful differentiation between the two. So I think within the food grade, so for us, one of our considerations is how we can take a process which is standardized for biotech manufacturing and actually ensure that we bring in the appropriate food regulations for our process to help our customers through their regulatory approvals. So now, if you're talking about microbial fermentation of growth factors, whether you're talking about farmer grade or food grade, it's a very similar manufacturing process. So, and in order to look at more cost-effective growth factors, which is also implied by the food grade label, we really need to start reaching those economies of scale.
Are there any emerging trends or research areas within this field that you find particularly exciting or promising? And that's a sort of a prelude to my final question.
I mean, I mentioned before some of the academic publications that are coming out using techniques such as single cell sequencing to really start to map exactly what we need in terms of the cell culture media conditions and understanding even basics like which cell types are actually within that culture. So I think we are going to have to get to that level of granularity to really be able to optimize culture medias. Current culture media recipes are based on what worked years ago and has happened to be developed through academic protocols or through maybe CHO cell manufacturing, the monoclonal antibody industry and things. So they've just evolved over time. There's really a space for going back to basics and working out what is present in fetal bovine serum, which is what we're all trying to replace, that has the right impact on the cells. So there's some really fundamental science there that could catapult change in the industry. And And that change for me is about getting more efficient biomass production or cell mass production within bioreactors. So that's really interesting, seeing sort of really high-tech publications coming out of groups like Mosa Meats and Mark Post's group. And really excitedly, I'm actually really watching this cultivated seafood space. I think I just, because seafood is, it's got high level. There's some seafoods. Obviously, overfishing is not very sustainable. Our oceans are incredibly important ecosystems. Things like microplastics and heavy metal accumulation and things. It would be really good to have an alternative to those sort of problems that are already in our food chain. But for me, from a scientist perspective, it's totally unknown, because we already know that, for instance, the sort of the conservation of these proteins, so the similarities between the same protein in different species can vary quite a lot. And again, it's not consistent. So you've got some proteins like the TGF-beta family proteins where they're highly conserved. But then you've got some proteins like EGFs where there's such differences between species that almost look like different proteins. And then when you take it to fish, where there's less sequence annotation of genome, you've got a whole extra set of challenges, scientific challenges, to really build a set of growth factors that will give you optimized production of fish cells. I think that's going to be really interesting.
Are you working with any companies in this alternative seafood sector? Are you able to tell us that? Because I've written a feature on this particular subject, and they're a great bunch of people.
Do you know what? I think that theme is through everybody I've met in this sector, and I think that's what makes it such a joy to work in. Everyone I've met has been absolutely lovely and just really driven to do the best they can in this sector. So we're just starting to talk to people in the cultivated seafood and particularly the bony fish sector. Although I was having an interesting conversation about whether we should be trying to make shark and things from, I think, all sorts of weird and wonderfuls. But it's certainly an interesting area. I would say, though, we don't have a set of growth factors for bovine yet. In terms of, like, as an industry, we're still using a mix and match between human and some porcine and some bovine. So I think before we move into some of these more complex species, we probably also need to sort out bovine space as well.
Mm-hmm. And finally, Dr. Catherine Elton, could you share your perspective on the future of growth factors in cultivated meat production and how this might evolve in the coming years, and also more generally, the future for cultivated meat?
So I don't think I'd be sitting here chatting with you if I didn't believe that cultivated meat could get to the market in the next 10 years or so. I genuinely think it's one of the ways that we can build food security in the future, and also overcome some of the health issues around antibiotic resistance and, as we've talked about, contamination and things, and be more sustainable. So I'm a big advocate for the space. I do think it will succeed. I feel we may have a sort of a back to basics for a couple of years, where we have first regulatory filings, and then we need to translate those processes into more scalable processes. So I think there's going to be a real drive for innovation over the next 5 years. And for growth factors in particular, what I would love to see is we rapidly innovate and iterate to identify the correct set of growth factors to give us the characteristics that we want for scalable growth in bioreactors. And then we look at how, as manufacturers and supply chain, we feel accountable to then working out how those correct growth factors can then be scaled effectively in a sustainable manner. And to be quite honest, we're very good at that innovation phase. And then we're actually fairly expression system agnostic, because a lot of that protein innovation can be applied into, for instance, plant molecular farming, or some of the really interesting hydroponics-based plant expression systems that are just becoming, or even some of the, like, the Drosophila systems and things, So I think we need to come together, these smaller companies that are supporting this supply chain, and combine our expertise and innovations to really push things forwards. And then as we scale, I would like to celebrate, because I think we'll have overcome some rather significant mild hurdles to get to scale.
Yeah. Well, the beers will be on me. Catherine, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. It's been fascinating. You've somehow managed to turn a very complex topic into something that was very digestible anyway for me. I'm sure our readers won't have the same trouble, but thank you very much for your time.